Okay, so welcome everyone. Those of you that are here in the library in person, I see quite a number of people on the Zoom call, so this is very interesting. This is the second talk in our series of Net Zero is Not Enough, our climate series sponsored by the Sierra Club and the Climate Reality project of Silicon Valley. I'm getting a signal that maybe there's an echo. You're hearing the echo as well.
You sound good to me.
I think you mute yourself. You're muted. I don't know. There's another microphone picking me up. I don't know. Let me turn off my own.
We've lost your audio.
I don't know how else to do this.
I'm hearing echo.
Maybe I can cover this. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Bear with me. Let's get to the the material and not deal with annoying technical difficulties. So a couple of guidelines for those of you who are on the Zoom call. Please all mute yourself, except the speaker, of course. If you have a slow or unstable connection and you're having difficulty with the connection on the videos, I suggest that you turn off your own video so that you're not using the bandwidth to show us your pretty face. Now, more seriously, if you have questions along the way on Zoom, please put them in the chat room. And we will go through them at the end of the talk. And also at the end, we'll accept, if you raise your hand, we'll try to notice and recognize you, and you can ask your question verbally. For those of you who are here in the room, please all keep your questions to the end. We'll go around and make sure everyone gets a chance to ask their questions. And if the Zoom callers can't hear you, I will repeat your question. So make sure I hear your question properly. One more important thing for those that are on the Zoom call, the restrooms are down this hall to my right, down here. I assume those that are on Zoom know where their nearest restroom is. Okay, so to business. Our speaker today is Brian von Herzen, PhD. He's the founder and executive director of the Climate Foundation. He received his bachelor's degree from Princeton University and his master's and PhD from Caltech. He founded the Climate Foundation, of which he is the executive director. It was founded in 2007. It's dedicated to regenerating healthy ecosystems in seas and soils. His team has developed marine permaculture technology as a route to large-scale seaweed mariculture and to provide sustainable food, feed, and fertilizer while providing ecosystem life support and sustaining carbon sinks. So that's the program that he's going to describe this evening. His title is Marine Permaculture, Forestation to Regenerate Offshore Kelp Forest Ecosystems. And we will make sure that he can share his screen. I think he should have permission to do that, but let me just double check that. Yep, okay, good. So Brian, thank you for joining us, and we can see your screen. Please go ahead.
I have to actually unmute, and then I can share my screen, so my apologies there. But thank you, Campbell. That was a great introduction, and I would encourage people to ask questions for clarification during the presentation as well, and happy to pick those up afterwards as well as part of the thread. It's great to be here today, and I think, Campbell, you've touched on something that's so important, and that is not only getting to net zero, but actually erasing some of our carbon footprints. And that is the 2,400 gigatons of carbon dioxide that we've emitted over the past 2 centuries that is presently affecting the global climate so significantly. So not only reducing emissions, certainly, but removing a lot of the carbon dioxide that we have placed in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. And then finally, repairing. And that's about getting back to a healthy climate. We work with partners such as Cambridge University and Princeton, and actually University of Santa Clara University. We have a student project working on some of our technological innovations there as well, and as well as the University of California. So we're very happy to have those partners. And I think getting back to a healthy climate is critical. And some of it is greenhouse gases, and some of it will be actually enabling us to regenerate lost ecosystems, whether it's regenerating kelp forests that have been lost offshore California, or in some cases, something as extreme as working to slow the melting of the Arctic sea ice and being able to get back to a healthy ecosystem and healthy climate in the Arctic as well. So with that, I will dive into our presentation. This is a version of a presentation that I gave at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography just a couple of weeks ago for their graduate students in marine ecology. So I'm looking forward to adapting it to this context and going on this journey with you to understand how can we transform our relationship, humanity's relationship with the ocean, from a historic one of extraction to one of regeneration, where we could potentially regenerate the kelp forests and the fish habitat that we've lost over the past century, be able to regenerate the fisheries that have been lost. Many of you might remember the sardine fishery of Monterey that existed even a century ago and was the economic basis for the formation of Cannery Row off of California. And yet we haven't seen those sardine populations return in the way that they existed some decades ago. And how could we actually enable that habitat and those populations to return? And then finally, can we measure the carbon that we know is fixed in the kelp forest? We're finding that on some of our platforms, up to a quarter of the carbon that is fixed by the seaweed forest actually falls off the seaweed forest during growth, sinks 1,000 meters a day to the seafloor, where in the deeper ocean, it can remain sequestered safely for centuries before it returns to the surface. And that's even after digestion by various macrofauna and microfauna that exist in the deep sea. So these represent some enormous opportunities to represent food security for more than 1 billion people who depend on the oceans for their primary sustenance, to regenerate ecosystems that have been lost, and to actually measure the carbon export of these regenerative interventions. So we've touched on some of these. There's a concept of One Health, and that is One Health for the planet and One Health for humanity are actually nicely aligned in that our civilization depends critically on healthy soils and healthy seas. And I believe that no civilization in the history of the planet has survived the collapse of the seas and the collapse of the soils. And our challenge and our opportunity is to ensure that we do not collapse either of those ecosystems on our watch, and ensure that most, if not all, of the species will remain alive on ocean planet Earth on our watch as well. And so I think that's really key. There are a number of health ramifications here when it comes to the health of our healthy ecosystems and human health. I take a little bit of seaweed every day, and look what's happened to me in the last few years. Doing well. And, there's evidence for reduction of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and improvement in digestion and immune system. So I do recommend looking into seaweed as a great food supplement for human health as well. Way back in 1900, humanity was emitting 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. In the last few years, we've increased that by more than a factor of 20. So it represents an enormous change in the amount of carbon dioxide that is being emitted each year. And I liken this 40 billion tons that we're emitting each year. Someone asked, how large a hole would we have to make to put all that CO2 away? Well, I did a calculation, and if we actually had if you tried to put all the CO2 in the atmosphere in one place, it would comprise a hole in the ground that was 200 kilometers in diameter and 100 kilometers deep. Now that's a very deep hole, but the sad thing is we're digging the hole deeper every year to the tune of 43 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And so when we finally get to net zero, we will have stopped digging the pit crater. But then we're at the bottom of the pit crater, and we have to crawl out of the pit crater, and we have to start filling it back in again. And so net zero is just the beginning, as Campbell was so aptly describing, and we really need to go beyond that. So that's a bit of the metaphor here. I was born in the late 50s in Southern California. My father was an oceanographer at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the time. And the year I was born, his office mate decided to start measuring the carbon dioxide on the side of Mauna Loa. And that was the beginning. His name was Dave Keeling, and that was the beginning of the Keeling curve. And so in many ways, I was born into this little community that was looking at carbon way back in the 1950s and really thinking ahead in a really amazing way. And he had several advisors, Walter Monk and Roger Revelle. And here's a picture of him in his early days working on experimental oceanographic equipment. And they figured out that the carbon dioxide was going up and then it could have a major effect. In fact, Roger Revelle gave his first report to then standing President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 on the role of greenhouse gases on our civilization. So the US federal government has been on notice for more than 55 years as to the effects of greenhouse gases. And yet there's been, to a great extent, half a century of prevaricating. And our challenge and our opportunity is to really transform our society and its sustainability. So we see this as a key opportunity. The ecosystems of the ocean are on the front lines of climate disruption today. The water is too warm and the nutrient levels are too low. It takes a little while to think about. I mean, when we think about 1 or 2 degrees of warming, and it's 1.2 Celsius right now, which is close to 2 degrees Fahrenheit, that doesn't sound like a lot. I mean, it's just, what's 2 degrees Fahrenheit? You just turn up your air conditioner a little bit. There's a lot of things you can do. However, we're living in an atmosphere where we can perspire and cool off, right? If you're in the ocean, there's no perspiration. There's no cooling that happens that way. So the creatures that are in the ocean and the ecosystems that are in the ocean are living. A better analogy would be a 2-degree fever, and that is 2 degrees Fahrenheit of fever, where the kelp forests and the coral reefs each summer are experiencing temperatures 2 degrees higher than what they can live with, and many of these ecosystems are living within 1 degree of mortality. So no wonder we're losing kelp forests from the coast of Northern California all the way down to Tasmania with substantial losses, because if you have a fever that long for a chronic period of time, it can have enormous health consequences. And that's what we're facing today. And what we see in the Pacific Ocean here, this is a bit of a schematic view of the oceans, where the Southern Ocean is represented by a cylinder, and the depth of the ocean is represented vertically. And one tributary of the Southern Ocean is the Pacific Ocean. And so this is a latitude picture horizontally from 60 degrees south to 60 degrees north. And Central California is going to be somewhere around 35 or 37 degrees north latitude. So we go up near the surface here and it looks very brown. What does the brown color mean? The brown means stratified ocean, that the warming that we've experienced over the past 6 decades has contributed to a stratification of the ocean, which means there's a lot of warm water up near the surface, and it forms a barrier to natural upwelling that provides all the nutrients to feed kelp forests, which means that in temperate latitudes, we've seen about 5% more stratification than occurred pre-industrially. And in tropical areas and subtropical regions, even Baja California, we've seen up to 20% increase in stratification in shallow waters. So this is a gap. It's a climate disruption gap that occurs because the water's too warm, causing the nutrient levels to be too low because there's a barrier to upwelling. And that forms the root cause of a lot of the problems that we see from kelp forests off the California coast, where more than 90% of that kelp forest has been lost in the last few decades, to all the way to the tip of Tasmania, where they've seen also losses of more than 90%. Now, I went back in the history books, and I found the U.S. Geodetic Survey did a USGS survey in 1853 of the coast of California. This is a picture of Santa Barbara on the map in 1853. And there's a little precursor to a harbor here. But what's notable is that the USGS actually plotted a continuous river of kelp from near Point Concepcion down perhaps past the Mexican border that was represented a continuous barrier and hazard to navigation. So what's amazing is in the 1850s, there was such a wide river of kelp, like a half a kilometer wide, that it would pose a navigational hazard for someone trying to get to Santa Barbara. Similarly, in 1868, again, a continuous river of kelp depicted offshore Santa Barbara. That occurred again in 1888. And it wasn't until the 1930s that that continuous river of kelp disappeared. Now, what happened then? Well, you'll notice all these rectangles and squares representing streets and also representing farming and cultivation that occurred there. And breaking the soil, causing siltation into the ocean and runoff had a very significant effect on the visibility of the waters behind me. You know, it looks very clear behind me, but when you've got dirt and silt and runoff and nutrients, it turns much darker and much more opaque. And the result is the juvenile kelps that normally grow from 25 meters all the way up to the surface don't get enough light to actually grow. And the result is that that portion of the kelp forest is lost, and only the shallow portions can remain. And even those, in recent years, can be seen in very small quantities near shore here. But the river of kelp, the continuous river of kelp, is gone, and that represented the first decimation of seaweed off the shores of California. In fact, I've got one photo here that actually shows the visibility line here. You can see the turbid, muddy waters that are near shore, and it's not till you get out to much deeper water that you have clearer water that can actually convey the light that's needed. And so we asked the question, what would it take to turn back the clock, to be able to go back to the time, let's say, of John Muir and of the, of a pre-industrial time, let's say, when we could actually, regenerate the kelp forest that existed pre-industrially. What would it take to actually achieve that? And then I will say, not only did we experience this decimation of kelp in the early 1900s, but in the last 20 years, we've gone from kelp represented in green here in these regions of Northern California. Under normal conditions, the water temperatures looked like they were in 2011. In 2014, there was a big warm blob of warm water that came down from the Alaska region and had a profound effect on the temperature offshore California. And then by 2015, there was a strong El Nino that had an even more severe effect on the temperatures of the ocean offshore California. And the result was a second decimation of kelp forest off Northern California. And that was a loss of more than 90% of the kelp off of the Northern California coast, because the water is too warm, the nutrient level is too low, and it resulted in a partial failure of the California current upwelling. So these are very dire situations, and they're situations that we'd like to be able to address with an intervention. I will note also that these kelp forests are extremely important because they're represented by the lower bars here. And this middle one is the net primary production in grams of carbon per square meter per year. And what's notable is that this kelp forest can produce up to 15% more carbon fixation per square meter per year than even the tropical rainforest like the Amazon. So in some ways, we could think of the California's kelp forest as being the Amazon of California, the Amazon rainforest offshore California. I think the forests offshore Northern California are very important as well. But Paul Revere once said, "Once if by land, twice if by sea," and we like to quote him from that because I think it'll take both lungs of the earth to actually regenerate healthy climate, and we should consider regeneration of healthy forests on land and in the sea, offshore California and around the world. So with that in mind, I will just point to the additional evidence of this data coming from offshore the east coast of Tasmania with a 95% losses of over 60% in tropical seaweeds as well. And our challenge and our opportunity is to regenerate the kelp forest ecosystems that existed offshore California and elsewhere pre-industrially and bring back healthy marine ecosystems at scale. So the solution that we're looking forward to describing and implementing and are presently doing at quarter-acre scale in the ocean is marine permaculture in the Pacific. And it's one that actually provides substrate for the seaweed forest offshore in deep water of greater than 100 meters deep, as well as deep water irrigation that can actually restore some of the natural upwelling that's occurred pre-industrially. And then furthermore, we've observed nature voting with her fins and coming back. We have squid eggs here, what we find on our forest, small turtles and game fish, as well as local forage fish that tend to live in the forest. In addition, I can report that we've identified thousands of sardines living under our platform. We've identified hundreds of tuna. Dozens of dolphin families have actually taken up residence around our platform for more than a month at a time. And we even had a 17-foot long whale shark come and visit us from hundreds of kilometers away and spend several days with us as well. So nature really is voting with their fins, and we're very thrilled to see those natural validations. So I'll ask the question, how does our deep water irrigation system work? Well, USC, the University of Southern California, has demonstrated an approach in 2021 off Southern California where we have a bit of a seaweed elevator, if you will. And that is the seaweed acts like a sponge and absorbs sunlight during the day. At sunset, the seaweed platform can be lowered down below the thermocline, below the nutricline, where nitrate and phosphate nutrients are available in the deep sea. And they actually soak into the seaweed. The seaweed absorbs them and collects them at night. And at sunrise, we lift the platform again back up to the surface where it absorbs sunlight and carbon dioxide in the top meter of the sea and presents a true blue carbon sink that actually grows seaweed robustly for most of the year. And we see that as really a key opportunity. There are also earlier techniques that we've done, including the actual upwelling of the water. And in the case of restoring kelp forests near shore, it may be necessary to do the upwelling. It generally takes more energy to do the upwelling, but we've been developing marine solar and wave energy approaches that can ultimately enable the use of local renewable energy to do all of these processes and to do so efficiently. And this overall approach enables, from 100 years ago, 120 years ago, San Diego was put on the map from its kelp harvest because they were harvesting over 100,000 tons of kelp every year and using it for smokeless gunpowder for the war effort in World War I. And that was one of the major things that really put San Diego on the map in the early 1900s. So these approaches are something that we can look at being able to sustainably harvest a healthy forest at the top meter and be able to maintain the habitat of the remaining 20 meters for fish and other wildlife, and be able to do so in a way that's sustainable and that provides ecosystem services as well as food security. Now, 2 or 3 years ago, we had a 100 square meter platform, this being a vertical drone shot image of the platform. And deep cycling has a lot of advantages. It doesn't upwell any carbon that exists already in the ocean. It doesn't deplete surface nutrients, and it's resilient to offshore conditions. In fact, we survived a Category 5 hurricane a year ago, December, And not only was the platform intact about 5 meters below the surface, but it survived 18-foot waves and 120-knot winds. And not only was the platform intact, but most of the seaweed was still on the platform. And the day after the hurricane, we were able to grow more seaweed. And in fact, we were able to provide a 1/4 ton of seedlings to our neighboring communities in the months following the hurricane to enable them to reseed as well. The seaweed grows really well under deep water irrigation. These green lines show growth rates of 100 to 300% per month, whereas the surface seaweeds were actually languishing during that time period and not growing well at all. And we've seen this in not only in 2020 and 2021, but over the last year in 2022 as well. Our program has been scaling in 4 phases, and we've just completed launching the 1,000 square meter platform that's about a 1/4 acre into the Pacific Ocean just in December. We're commissioning that platform now, and we'll be growing seaweed next quarter on that platform. Furthermore, we are very close to, we've raised 3/4 of the funds that we'll need to scale a full economically sustainable hectare that should enable coastal communities to regenerate a hectare of seaweed forest, be able to sustainably yield food, feed, and fertilizer products from it, and also benefit ecosystems, including forage fish habitat, including potentially food for some creatures. I was interested to learn that not only sea urchins, but lobsters and other creatures eat a significant amount of seaweed. Lots of invertebrates eat seaweed as well as vertebrate fishes. Here's a short animation of our platform that's a 1/4 acre in size. Let's see if this runs. And let me know if you can't hear the sound. Oh, okay. The seaweeds are growing on the outer circle. We have marine circle. And this presents a scalable platform that can grow a suitable help for our community. Here's our team in the Philippines that have been instrumental in getting our system to work. Why the Philippines? Well, there's a 250,000 seaweed farmers in the Philippines today. It takes a very long permitting process in California waters, we can do in a matter of just months in the Philippines. And we have a large social acceptance by the local communities and municipalities to help to regenerate their lost seaweed production services. We're very interested in bringing the first hectares to California as soon as we can, and interested to explore how we can enable that off of California waters at first at model scale, and then demonstrating the efficacy, and with our marine ecology partners, demonstrating its benefits for ecosystems as well as for the economies of those coastal communities. This is our dedicated and validated 100 square meter deployment underwater. It looks a little bit like this, and we've got seaweed that grows underneath. We have a variety of red, green, and brown seaweeds, and some of the seaweed falls off the platform during growth. We can measure that and count that as a true blue carbon sink and quantify it robustly. And we're very happy with the variety of seaweeds that grow. The platform is intended to enable there's 14,000 species of seaweed globally around the world. And the approach is to use local varieties of red, green, and brown seaweed and local fishes to be able to regenerate the primary production in waters offshore that can effectively provide a complement to the coastal resources that were available pre-industrially. Here's a picture of the ring as it's descending into the deep, and you can just barely see, perhaps in the background, the ring as it descends deeper. And that was our key to surviving this super typhoon Rai that occurred in December 2021, with some of our partners and colleagues in coastal communities that received some of the 1/4 ton of seaweed during the past year. Our surface platform enables marine solar collection. We have energy storage and electric motors enabling this platform to work robustly in all sorts of conditions. And I think there's a picture of this platform. This scale platform and represents a great chance for us to scale by order of magnitude. And this is a picture of our quarter-acre platform already deployed. The 100 square meter system that you'd seen before is the small circle, and we've now increased the area by a factor of 10 that we're presently have in the water and are commissioning to grow seaweed in the months ahead. Here's an oblique view of the same system and the platform, the quarter-acre platform on the beach, preparing for launch. I think this is a picture of some of the platform from underwater and give you a sense of scale. We have the platforms there, one large area with a bunch of rigging that we use to maintain the platform and enable it to grow seaweed effectively. And this is just another view of the quarter acre. See if I can progress this. Underwater, we've got seaweed that's sinking, and we are able to measure that sinking, and that represents the leaves falling from the tree. And it turns out fall more than 1,000 meters per day, and as a result, in a matter of hours, they're actually reaching the seafloor, and that puts it out of the surface waters, and at depths of 300 to 1,000 meters or more, that represents multiple centuries of carbon sequestration that is possible given the radiocarbon ages that we know for the deep water and this ocean circulation that determines how it will sink. We use catcher's mitts, if you will, sediment traps and other kinds of traps to collect the seaweed and measure the flux of seaweed falling per square meter per day for each of our harvests. And this peer-reviewed diagram shows that at depths greater than 300 meters, there's potential for many decades, if not a century, of sequestration. And as we drop the seaweed down below 1,000 meters, it's possible to approach 1,000 years of sequestration with this general approach. In fact, for the North Pacific, on the right here, we can see that for 30 degrees north, if you're able to bring the seaweed down to a depth of a couple thousand meters, there's 800 to 1,000 years of sequestration that's possible, given this chart on the right that estimates the time, the number of years before the next contact of these waters with the atmosphere. So there's a schematic on our carbon on the planet, and that is humanity has put a third of the carbon in this black square, and that is atmospheric carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere over the past 2 centuries. And our challenge and our opportunity is to regenerate marine ecosystems that could uniformly, the biological pump, if you will, can redistribute much, if not most, of that carbon from the surface ocean and the atmosphere into the middle and deep ocean, represented by this very large blue rectangle. And that's the dissolved inorganic carbon in the oceans today. In fact, there's 45 times more carbon in the oceans today than the entire atmosphere. So keeping the biological pump healthy is really the key challenge and opportunity to enabling us to ensure that we can get that carbon back out of the atmosphere and the surface ocean into the deep ocean from whence it came originally. We do that, and we want to do that economically sustainably. And initially, we see food, feed, and fertilizer products as being really key to enabling the economic sustainability of these approaches long term. Seaweed's been used as food in Asia for hundreds of years, and probably 95% of the seaweed consumption today is in Asia. And that's one reason we're working in the Western Pacific initially. But we're looking forward to regenerating kelp forests in the Eastern Pacific near California in future years, and really working to build capacity for that effort in the months and years ahead. We're also finding that a very significant product here is this fertilizer products. These are agricultural amendments. It's not a fertilizer itself. We think of these seaweed foliar biostimulants as a fertilizer multiplier. And you may notice on your tomato plants, if you get some seaweed biostimulants, you can dilute it and spray it onto leaves in the morning. It goes into the plants through the stomata of the leaves. And the natural plant growth regulators in seaweed upregulate the gene expression of the plants. And whether it's horticulture or fruit trees or nut trees or even row crops, the plants are upregulated, the gene expression of the plants is upregulated, and it actually improves the uptake efficiency of nitrate and phosphate into the soil, which means that you can actually maintain production with 20% less nitrate fertilizer, and that represents 20% less fossil fuels to produce that fertilizer, 20% less nitrous oxide production, which is a greenhouse gas with 300 times the potency of carbon dioxide, and 20% less runoff back into the ocean. So we see this as a really great agricultural intervention that works not only with these rice fields, but also Chinese cabbage and all sorts of fruits and vegetables and row crops that are common in California today. This being a Chinese cabbage example that was done by the government of the Philippines as a certification trial for our producing the biostimulant commercially. So we see a seaweed value chain that includes growing seaweed. Sorry, I'll go back one. It includes on these hectare scale platforms being able to produce food, feed, and fertilizer products. It includes dry pulp of seaweed that can be used for food products, whether it's ingredients that go into your toothpaste and ice cream, or other kinds of food products like dried seaweed and even whole seaweed. And finally, there's some residual seaweed that goes back to the deep sea, and that can represent a true blue carbon sink for centuries, if not millennia. Each hectare should be able to produce hundreds of tons of seaweed, and at the same time, hundreds of tons of products, and potentially up to 80 tons per year of carbon fixation, representing a true blue carbon sink. And there are additional benefits that we've mentioned in the agricultural space. We're working right now. We've raised more than 2 of the 3 million that we'll need to build the first hectare in the Pacific Ocean. And we're hoping to raise the rest that will enable us to ultimately launch a healthy community-based seaweed mariculture industry offshore that can bring the cost down exponentially as we go through a dozen and then 100 and 1,000 hectares, and be able to regenerate those the livelihoods of those communities and the food security of those communities. So we're looking forward to doing that. Each hectare that we do grow and put in the ocean should be able to sink at least 8,000 tons, or fix at least 8,000 tons of carbon dioxide each hectare, each square kilometer, I should say, each year. Potentially 12,000 tons of avoided fertilizer CO2 emissions associated with the fertilizer production, and potentially 10,000 tons of CO2 equivalent reduced emissions from the nitrate fertilizer. So this represents a great approach, and our life cycle analysis has indicated costs of only around 10 or 20% of these emission reductions and removals. And so it looks like a very sustainable approach. In fact, the US Department of Energy has estimated that in an optimistic scenario, less than 2% of the US exclusive economic zone would be enough to fix a gigaton of carbon, which at the same time, I believe, would enable us to provide a huge amount of increased food security globally and be able to regenerate habitat, fish habitat, and ecosystem services that could help to regenerate a healthy ocean. In fact, in many ways, our ocean planet Earth has so many what we'll call big ocean nations, including the United States, with the second largest exclusive economic zone of the entire world. And each of these regions represents an opportunity for the localized nations and countries to use their mostly empty ocean to help to regenerate life on the planet, regenerate some of the oxygen that we depend on so strongly with the forests of the ocean as well as the forests of the earth, and ultimately sustain the food security and the kind of carbon export that we'll need to regenerate a healthy climate. You've probably all flown over crop circles on land. In the future, further offshore than is depicted here, we'd anticipate having perhaps kelp forest circles in the sea that could be a hectare in size or larger, and would ultimately enable the regeneration of healthy ecosystems offshore in ways that are resilient to navigation and would enable regeneration of ecosystem services, as well as continued food security with reduced impacts on terrestrial environments. It's good not only for the kelp forest, but also for the coral reef. These particular slides illustrate the amount of coral bleaching that's occurred in recent years off of the coast of Queensland, Australia, here where I'm talking with you from. And in fact, we've done work in American Samoa as well, measuring the color of the corals with this Coral Watch health chart. the corals were bleaching every year, and you can see that with the light color here. And with a little bit of deep water irrigation, these corals came back to color. We thought it would take 3 months, but they came back to color in just 24 hours or less. And in fact, not only did they come back to color quickly, in less than 24 hours, but then we changed our treatment zone and they retained color for up to 2 weeks at level 4 or level 5 color intensity relative to the corals nearby that didn't have the deep water irrigation and the corals that were bleached previously. So we see long-term the possibility to grow seaweeds that are local to the coral reef as well and be able to help regenerate healthy ecosystems off the coral reefs in addition. We have a global team with more than 24 colleagues working with us from California and the US through Europe and Australasia. And our Philippine team is more than a dozen people now. They're doing really well in helping to scale our overall approach. These are some of the health ramifications that I touched on a recent presentation, including moving from an omega-6 diet to an omega-3 diet. And there's an opportunity to do that. And I think it helps a significant effect on the cognitive health span of people to move from a Western diet more towards an omega-3 rich diet. And of course, seaweed and other algae are the root source of the omega-3 long-chain fatty acids that we all depend on for cognitive health span. We are so grateful to our partners, including Paul Hawken, who has written not only Drawdown, but also Regeneration and edited that. Jean Dore included us in his Speed and Scale book recently. And we're very honored and grateful to have been a recipient of the X Prize for Carbon Removal Milestone Award that was provided just last April. So with that, I'll be happy to turn it over to questions. Feel free to reach us at our Climate Foundation email, or alternatively, you can get a hold of me through the Sierra Club. And I look forward to talking with you more about marine permaculture and how we can use it to help regenerate a healthy climate in our lifetimes in the oceans. So thank you very much. Back to you, Campbell. And I'll check the chat to see if there are any questions coming in online as well. All right, well, Campbell's getting online. I see a couple of questions that have come in. One of them is by Molly, and that is, will regenerating the kelp forest have a positive effect on starfish? Well, it turns out starfish is a very interesting story. You may remember those slides that talked about the big warm blob that came down from Alaska and warmed up the waters off California so much. And it turns out these temperature increases have some very profound effects on sea life in general and invertebrates in particular. In the case of the sea urchins and the starfish end up getting a starfish wasting disease when they're slightly warmer, and they weren't able to ward off those microbial infections. And as a result, many of the starfish were lost. And of course, starfish like to eat sea urchins. And not only that, sea urchins are unusual invertebrates. Most invertebrates tend to slow down when they get warmer. They get a little lazier, perhaps, or a little slower in their metabolism. But sea urchins are the exception. They actually get more active, more ravenous at the higher temperatures. So not only is the seaweed growing less well, but the sea urchins start getting hungry. And at a certain density, they go from eating the apples that are on the ground, and that is they won't rove around and try to find the seaweed, to eating the apple trees. And they actually take out the bottom inch or two of kelp, and then of course the whole kelp tree disappears. So they're a bit like beavers sawing down the forest, and that's contributed to the loss of kelp forest in Northern California. So there's multiple imbalances, and sadly both the loss of starfish and the creation of urchin barrens with lots of zombie sea urchins walking around trying to find something to eat represent a collapse of an ecosystem And I think you can measure the resilience and the robustness of an ecosystem by the biodiversity, by the number of species, and the way they build a scaffolding, if you will, of healthy ecosystems around each other and with mutual dependencies for value chains and for survival of those seaweeds, of those species. So these collapsed state of urchin barrens represents a real challenge, and it's an opportunity to try to do something about it. And so I think I don't really blame the sea urchins, because that was just what happens when the water gets warmer. You get these shifts and potential collapses. But we have to work to get our environmental conditions back and be able to, there are efforts to try to harvest as many of the sea urchins as possible and rehabilitate them and enable them for good food markets, et cetera. And I think we'll have to take care of 99% of the urchin problem as it is now. It's like a stitch in time saves 9. Sadly, we've seen this collapse. We've got to do a lot more work to get it back to a healthy state. But ultimately, off shores of California, we can anticipate growing seaweed with deep water irrigation in the summer and autumn, and bringing it near shore into the coves where the kelp forest used to be in the winter and in the springtime. And in regions where the urchins had been cleared, sporulation occurs in the late autumn, and that enables a reseeding, if you will, of the nearby shoreline with local kelps that are perhaps thermally more tolerant than the ones historically. And we're hoping that that can be part of the regeneration effort for restoring healthy kelp forests right near the shoreline. A couple more questions. Carolyn writes, general discussion was had, technology, comment around lighting as well. And there's something interesting in New Zealand, the largest gold status dark sky reserve in the world in Iraqi Mackenzie. I look forward to hearing more about that. And we're very grateful to be Edmund Hillary Fellows working with the Edmund Hillary Fellowship and Edmund Hillary Laureates to actually help regenerate kelp forest off of New Zealand as well. Thank you, Jack, for the compliments. And Lisa asks about manual clearing of red and purple sea urchins around the Monterey Bay region. And that is a good example. I think there is a chance, the zombie sea urchins that are offshore in these urchin barrens are very hungry, and even the sea otters won't go near them because they're almost empty inside. And so the otters know this, and they don't want to eat those sea urchins. So they prefer sea urchins that are inside the kelp forest. And so I think the challenge is to capture some of those. And we need a good supply of kelp in order to feed those sea urchins and rehabilitate them over a period of 6 to 8 weeks. And then after that, they could be potentially brought to sea urchin uni markets from California to the Asian markets. And so we'll have to explore what will be the sustainable value chains that can help us to regenerate a healthy ecosystem. Well, wonderful. Carolyn apparently knew Sir Edmund Hillary. So it's wonderful to hear that. And right now, we're actually considering a mission venture studio with the Edmund Hillary group, the Institute, and the fellowship, to actually look at building capacity for marine permaculture at all scales to help regenerate kelp forests across the Pacific Ocean. And so I encourage you to check that out in more detail. And if you can, check out our website, where we have a campaign right now to build a hectare of marine permaculture in the Pacific, the very first one. And this will be the world's largest deep water irrigation platform. We have a history of this deep water irrigation approach going back to the early 1980s when I was at Caltech. And let's see, Professor Wheeler North, I believe, was working on actually growing seaweeds offshore then. We've come a long way since then, and I'm looking forward to seeing how we can progress this as we go forward. So with that, feel free to add any other questions you might have, and be happy to follow up. And maybe the folks with Campbell Scott can unmute when they can, and we can take more questions from the live audience. So thank you for that. See, Tommy writes, can you speak more to the challenges encountered and anticipate exploring permitting projects along California coast? Well, that's a great question. we're working with partners like Scripps Institution of Oceanography and some universities to actually do an experimental research permit to demonstrate deep water irrigation and how well it would work for kelps offshore California. We anticipate being able to get such permitting in a matter of months, whereas typically to do a commercial permit for an acre near shore can sometimes take people many years, 3 to 6 years, and even in some cases a dozen years or longer, because there are 17 state and federal agencies that have some jurisdiction over the kelp in that region. What we have found is that there's a new model we're developing here in Australia, and that is with the Australian Coast Guard to register marine permaculture vessels as ocean-going barges that will fly the flag of Australia, or in the future with the U.S. Coast Guard, fly a U.S. flag, and have the right of safe passage, as the U.S. Navy is protecting that right in the Pacific today. And so there's 500 years of maritime law that indicates that we could actually use that approach to enable safe passage of vessels. There are no inputs being provided to the ocean, and so it provides an opportunity to grow and harvest systems. And you may have heard the last week's news about the High Seas Treaty, where I think the United Nations is planning to enable 30% of the ocean to be protected by 2030. And we see marine permaculture arrays as being great ways, very compatible with marine protected areas, because we can accelerate the regeneration of kelp forest and other seaweed forests. We'll be able to regenerate the production of fish habitat, and it will be able to accelerate the production, the regeneration of healthy ecosystems in those protected areas, whether or not areas end up being protected and then in adjacent regions sustainable food security as well. So it requires balance, I believe. And I hope the video is going okay. My video stopped a little bit, but thank you so much for your interest and attention. And
Campbell, you're muted.
I was muted. Okay. So Brian, thank you again. As I said, apologize for some of the technical issues, but I think we all got a great deal out of your wonderful presentation, and we look forward to hearing more about your organization in the future. Thank you.